history. And our panelists are Tom Doyle, I'm sorry, this is not in order, Nicole Glover, Alan Smale, and we have another panelist who may show up soon, Chidumebi Njoku Brown. So we started with the idea that it might seem counterintuitive to some people that science fiction and fantasy writers would engage with history, since science fiction is associated with imagining the future. I'm sure none of you have that naive idea, but it's sort of playing up on that. And I found an interesting quote from Ada Palmer, who's a historian and a science fiction author. She says, "Some people find it funny for a historian to be writing science fiction, and they say the future is the opposite of the past. But there's nothing more like the future than the past. It's a long period of time in which societies change and disruptive technologies appear and political groups shift." And so there's many thriving subgenres that you're probably familiar with, but that's what we're going to be talking about. There's alternate histories, there's retelling historical events from different, not as well recognized perspectives, and introducing speculative elements into historical narratives. And all of these, which our authors have done, and Chidumebi, a historian, is interested in, have the potential to not only entertain us, but to expand our understanding of history. And one great example is the Afrofuturism movement, where authors like Nisi Shawl have imagined history coming out in a different way. Not necessarily easier, but different and inspiring in some ways. I'm going to start by introducing people, and then each of them will get the mic. Tom Doyle is the award-winning author of the American Craftsman trilogy from Tor Books, a saga of modern-day magician soldiers and psychic spies that has elements of secret history. He's also written the Agents of Exiles series of supernatural spy adventures set in the 6th century BCE, which is out from Graphic Audio. And his science fiction novel Border Crosser goes into the far future with Eris, a secret agent of chaos in the galaxy. Tom has survived Harvard, Stanford, and cancer. Alan Smale writes alternate history and hard science fiction. He's published 2 alternate history trilogies. The first about a Roman invasion of ancient America, and the second imagining a different path for the Apollo space program. They're both great. His work has won 2 Sidewise Awards for alternate history, and his short stories have appeared in Asimov's Galaxy's Edge, Abyss and Apex, and numerous other magazines and anthologies. Alan grew up in Yorkshire, England, and he worked until recently at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. What a panel. Nicole Glover is the author of the historical fantasy series Murder and Magic, which begins with The Conductors. Her latest novel, The Starseekers, arrives in 2026. She's been a Locus bestseller and won the 2024 Webster Award. When she's not writing, she is a UX researcher where her knowledge about murder and other mysteries is surprisingly useful. I think I may as well read Chidumebi's bio, and then hopefully we'll get to see him. Chidumebi Njoku Brown is a teacher of African history and folklore to students age 11 to 19. He's given lectures on African history at Balticon, has been a volunteer educator at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and a researcher at the Museum of African American History. Oh, and here he is! A black entrance! That cannot be beat. Chidumebi was raised in Nigeria before moving to Maryland and eventually Pennsylvania, where he currently resides. So, welcome.
Thank you. Traffic's a nightmare, everyone.
So I'd like to ask each of you to start by talking about your own approach to using history in your work, or your own interest in history as it's used in speculative fiction, and maybe explain whatever particular subgenre you work in.
So yeah, I'm Tom Doyle, and I'm going to talk to you about secret history, because that's what I do mostly. The others here will probably talk more about alternative histories and such, where something changed, something maybe small or big changed, and our timeline has diverged, and Romans are invading ancient America, as you see there. No, mine involves a element where there is history as we know it happened, okay? All the publicly documented things happened. But beneath that, there is some fantastical history going on that explains the public history. So, you know, we know the events. We know that George Washington got his army, saved his army at Brooklyn Heights due to bad weather. Well, what if the reason he was able to save his army at Brooklyn Heights was that he had a magician on staff, you know, who was able to, at that point, just as necessary, bring in the fog and get himself the nickname of Foggy Morton. So that's the sort of thing I wrote in the American Craftsman books, where there's been a history since European colonial times in America, where these magician soldiers and psychic spies have been causing mischief and changing the course of history into the course of history that we know. Now, there are lots of people who do this sort of secret history, and I'd like to cite to Tim Powers, because people talk about the Tim Powers rule, which when he does secret history, he changes nothing in the public history. If someone was someplace on a certain date and that's documented, that happened that way, and you have to work your secret history around the facts. So it's very much writing secret history with a net, as a poet once said. Probably his most famous book where he does that is a book called Declare, which was about the Kim Philby and the Cambridge Five moles in British intelligence. And it basically does their whole history, explaining all their motions and betrayals and the people around them in these occult terms. There's this whole occult thing going on beneath the surface, and they're basically a sort of explained version of wizardry that they're doing, and it involves the secret codes and radio transmissions and weird gods from the before times, and that explains Kim Philby. But there's another way to do secret history, and that's to be a bit more loosey-goosey about it. And I even think that the old TV show Wild Wild West is a kind of secret history in that way, where yes, you have a President Grant, you have the American West, the Civil War did happen, but within that, weird, anachronistic scientists are inventing matter transport devices and time machines and such. And that's going on, and you have James Bond wandering around at a time and a place where James Bond really doesn't fit, but we're going to have James Bond. And that's what you have in those, and that's what I have in my Agent of Exile series, where James Bond and other secret agent archetypes are wandering around in the 6th century BCE. And it's a great time to wander around it. Herodotus has all kinds of crazy stories about what was going on then. And if you just believe Herodotus, the crazy stuff is already there, and perfectly able to slot in the equivalence of having Croesus as the spy master of Cyrus, and having the niece of Thales of Miletus is Q, making all these weird devices for our spies and such. So yes, you can have both the big names of who was Pharaoh, who's the Persian king. All that can be, big picture true, and yet beneath it, it's just pulpy fun chaos. So that's the spectrum of secret history. And I think that explains both my historical work and secret history, so I'm going to pass the mic.
Okay, and that's a great segue into me. You've already got some of the excitement of messing around with history from Tom. I'm the alternate history guy. I'm Alan Smale. I wrote the Clash of Eagles trilogy from Del Rey and my alternate Apollo trilogy starting with Hot Moon, and that's out from Kasich Science Fiction and Fantasy. And with alternate history, it's kind of a variant here. With alternate history, things can change. Weather can change the results of a battle. We've seen recently that one person's decisions can have a great bearing on how history moves forth after that point. And so alternate history is really exploring that kind of thing, that kind of spectrum. What if something different had happened? What if the Second World War had gone differently? That's kind of a very common trope. What if the British hadn't killed their king in the 17th century? How would society have gone on after that? What if the gunpowder plot had succeeded? All of this kind of thing. And I think one of the joys of alternate history is that you know the real history, and so you can look at the alternate history. It adds a depth and a resonance to the alternate history. You have this kind of mirror that's being held up to reality, and you can really play with that resonance. Just like secret history, alternate history actually is also a spectrum, he says, gesturing with the mic. You have the really rigorous alternate histories, where you just take one change and rigorously follow it through, and everything happens in a very logical way. And Harry Turtledove is one of the grand old guys who's doing that kind of alternate history. On the other hand, you have steampunk, and that's a little bit of a crossover with what Tom was talking about with Wild Wild West, where there's a lot of anachronisms, everything is kind of crazy, it's a romp, and it's a lot of fun. But it's not really strictly alternate history by the purist sense, but still very interesting and very entertaining to read. I think alternate history, like science fiction itself, has gone through several stages. And at the beginning, people were talking about just studying the history itself, and the fiction was very event-driven. I think nowadays, and we can talk about this more later if necessary, nowadays things have got a little more conceptual. It's not so much about the exact point of divergence, but the effects on society, the effects on people, on humanity, the human stories behind it. So now you often have alternate histories like Joe Walton's alternate histories, where you're really concentrating on the people rather than the events. It's more of a people story with this different backdrop that it is giving you that additional resonance. And I think I'll stop there and pass the mic along.
Hi, I'm Nicole, and I write historical fantasy. All my books are out through the public library. They're exploring a particular historical fantasy of the late 19th century, going through 20th century, particularly on Black history. And with historical fantasy, it blends some of the elements of secret history and the alternate history aspect, but still kind of sticks with the history. The reason for historical fantasy is because we chose that particular time period we want. So you kind of stick with some of the key events, some of the major events, and add layers of magic and other spectacle elements to it. Sometimes it's just a blend of it, sometimes it's just for vibes. I find a lot of historical fantasy out there is more of like, you want the window dressing of the 17th century, the 18th century, they get the vibes of the time period, because lots of people aren't coming to historical fantasy for accuracy. They want the dresses, they want the no cell phones and no cars or such a situation. And I kind of view historical fantasy as respecting the adherence to the history, but also kind of digging deep to see the nuances that we don't explore. Particularly for me, looking into areas of particularly Black history that we don't really talk about mainstream. So it's finding a way to highlight these stories, but also a way to present it that it's clear that one aspect that, yeah, here's the magic side, but here's also the realistic side, and kind of encourage people to explore. And I think historical fantasy allows people to feel history is more approachable, because lots of times we'll see certain errors, certain events, and see like, oh, it's too heavy, I don't want to deal with this, or it's just numbers or dates. And historical fantasy brings people in with other plots, particularly for me, because my stories also include a murder mystery, so we get all these fun elements inside the genre. For me to play with as a writer, but also for readers to have fun to engage with. And with anything, there is a scope and scale, like I mentioned. People like vibes, and people like the really accurate things. We want to see an alternate history of like the Napoleonic Wars of Dragons, basically, which is very popular. There's a popular series out there. And it tackles these things, but also just exploring the nuances of things. I think that's the beauty of adding speculative elements to fantasy, to history, is that we can see things from different light perception and see things that maybe, this is give a unique view of point of things that kind of turn the way we view histories and just pull out nuances you might not expect to begin with.
Hello, everyone. My name's Cheetah Maybe, and I don't have a trilogy yet. But I do dabble in a bit of alternative fantasy history, but also more in alternative economic history. Because if you look at a lot of historical events, there were moments where people almost came upon a resource, thought it useless, and just bypassed it. What if people had known what these things were for? What if they had found a use for them? While I mainly focus in alternate West African history as well, I have also dabbled in alternate Roman history. I assume, are you all familiar with the fact that the Romans had actually built a functioning steam engine during the time of the early Roman Empire? But they then thought it was useless. They had automatic doors, they had vending machines. What if they had gone further with those technologies that we think are too advanced, but as we turned out, people either ignored or just forgot the knowledge to? But with alternate African fantastical history, it's more like, what does the world of these West African communities look like if a lot of the local spirits or even the local gods were real? How does that affect the history of colonialism? How do the various empires react to the existence of these? How does that affect the social dynamics? How does that affect the day-to-day, everyday lives? How does that even affect the fashion? For just a quick little example, one of the various 4 blacksmiths gods of Igbo culture, which have a rivalry over which smithing process is better. Does one become more worshipped with the advent of gunpowder technology being improved? Or is there going to be a little rift because now the god of making swords and spears is now being less worshipped than the god who is good at making firearms? Because there was a god of firearms. So that is my main focus, and it also informs sci-fi, because you can look at this, how does a sci-fi world operate if a lot of the gods, major and minor on Earth, turned out to be real in some way? How does that affect things like space travel? Do you see people praying to Helios for giving them a good solar wind to allow their spaceship to travel further? Or do you ask Hermes to make sure that your interstellar warp field doesn't disrupt in the middle and you go careening into a black hole? That sort of thing. So that's why I like to explore both in the fantasy section and in the science fantasy section. So I'll pass it on to the rest of you guys.
I think what's coming out and is interesting is that you can approach this in a more straight arrow way and just deal with this narrative ramifications of a change in a point of history, or you can throw some magic in there. And I think, Alan, you're the hard SF guy here. So, but everybody else is willing to entertain the influence of even your Romans. Do they believe in their gods, or they're probably like modern Romans because they're several centuries later?
They actually believe in a variety of gods. They believe in the Christ risen, which is obviously the Council of Nicaea never took place in my universe. I should mention that the turning point in my books, in the Clash of Eagles books, is in the 212 AD. So the crisis of the 3rd century never happens in Roman history, and the Roman Empire survives. The Roman Empire was actually very stable for several hundred years, and I saw no reason why it couldn't survive even longer. So the books themselves are set in the 13th century, when the Romans are now going over to ancient America. And so they don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's happened in the time in between. They have a variety of gods. Some believe in their gods, others do not believe in their gods. There's also a strong Native American part of this book. It's set around the city of Cahokia, and there's very much the idea of gods. Some people believe more than others, but they do have priests. They do have things that they consider to be magic or sacred in there, and part of the clash of cultures is figuring out how those things work together and play together in the narrative.
Yeah, I do find that fascinating, especially since one of the problems with I've seen in some fantasy, even alternate fantasy, is people having a strict adherence to the pantheon of origin, which is not what we see in actual history. You were just as likely, for example, to have a Roman guy praying to both a Roman god and an Egyptian god just because he was traveling to Egypt, because he would think, hey, it wouldn't hurt to pray to this god since I'm going to Egypt. There is a lot of syncretism, and even in works like D&D, they don't espouse that syncretism. They espouse a strict adherence to the deities, which takes it out, because a lot of people have it. Like, for example, look at Latin American cultures. You have a lot of references to a lot of the classic gods from their history, but also merged with a lot of Christian elements, like Santa Maria, or them still talking about La Muerte. Because if La Muerte wasn't still known about, the film The Book of Life wouldn't have been made, if that wasn't still a concept that was around. And Coco shows a lot of that syncretic conflicts. If you see the film Coco, you see a lot of images of Aztec imagery, Mayan imagery, as well as later Christian imagery to show that it's all merged. Religion tends to become, and theology tends to become a soup over time, through trade, through conquest, and through sometimes diplomacy, or certain councils having an argument over what should or should not be put in the official canon, as they say.
Just quickly, with my magician soldiers and American craftsmen, magic has made shockingly little difference in the religious beliefs across the world where people are practitioners. It's like, it just makes a difference on the formula. So you have the descendants of Puritans, still being Puritans, still like saying they just have to throw in a little nod to God every time, or they've committed the sin of Moses of operating as if the power is theirs and not coming from above. You have atheistic ones who go, this is just weird physics we don't understand yet, but I'm doing it for now. You have all that going on. And the syncretisms, you go back to the 6th century BCE people, and of course it's like, Herodotus just thinks every god system is just another set of names from the same people he knows, and you have the granddaughter of Zoroaster talking to a rogue secret agent of the Judean court in exile, and just speculating, well, is this the same guy or not that we're talking about, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's fun to see that religion is, in various times and places and in alternative visions, much more plastic than we usually think about it.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe we could have another panel on alternate religions. Because it seems to sneak in the back door. So, Tom, you had an idea that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to ask these folks. So, in looking at their work and such, I've noticed one theme. I've got two things here, but one is, it seems one thing that alternate history is doing is it expands from this sort of very focused on the history and focusing on the people, is exposing how it makes a difference, not just what happens in a technologically or military deterministic way, but who does the things in various alternate histories. And I'm thinking of your story, particularly Kitty Hawk, if you want to talk about that one, Alan, and also talking about Nicole's vision of a post-Civil War and interwar period where who has the magic and what they're doing that makes a big difference. To certain events, I think, have been changed by that. So I'd like to hear from that today.
Okay, the story Tom is talking about, Kitty Hawk, was published in Asimov's Science Fiction and Fantasy in 2017 or 2018 or something. I'm gratified that people still keep talking about it at science fiction conventions. And in this one, as you might guess from the name, it's basically an alternate history about the Wright brothers and sister. Because in this story, the sister, their real life sister, Catherine, who was actually working behind the scenes to help them in our timeline, actually plays a much more prominent role. It's not much of a spoiler because it happens at the very beginning of the story that we find out that in fact one of the brothers has died at Kitty Hawk as the result of the gliding experiments, and so Catherine comes down and is helping the surviving brother with those first flights. And as a result of that, history takes off in the 20th century in a completely different way. And so I think it is an important question about who does things more generally. In terms of work that is not mine, something we haven't talked about yet is time travel. A lot of alternate history does in fact use time travel as a mechanism. When I was putting together an hour-long talk on the history of alternate history, I actually, maybe a third of the works that I had by other people in that presentation, they were time travel narratives where the time travel wasn't the important thing, the alternate history was the important thing. Sometimes the time traveler is the person who changes the timeline, so they can be the motivating event. But in terms of, time travel often enables you to have several different alternate histories within the same work. And the reason what I'm leading up to here is that there's a very good book by Annalee Newitt's History of Another Timeline. And in that, she's really, in addition to the adventure side of it, she's also really interrogating the reader. She's asking, okay, when you change history and make it better, you make it better for who exactly? Do you make it better for some conceptual thing? Do you make it better for the standards of society as they exist, the patriarchal society exists? Do you make it better for women? What do you do? So, and that's a very well-written book which won the Sidewise Award a few years ago and is well worth picking up. So yeah, who tells the story, who benefits? Those are very important themes, I think, in modern science fiction and in historical fiction, fantasy, and alternate history.
Great segue for me because I found that a lot of the historical research for my book, so really a lot, because even though it's fantasy, I want to make sure I'm accurate. And I spent a lot of time looking at the smaller players in these stories, the inventors, the curators, the dressmakers, the barbers, things like stories. I thought were always interesting to me because in general, I like learning the history of people who made things, who made the inventions that we use day to day, that are kind of pioneered certain ideas. And it's fascinating learning how those people, not just how their voices were kind of erased and we forgot about them, but also how I could play with these characters with conviction. And a lot of my stories kind of feature kind of players in these kind of bit roles, using the ways to kind of explore the aspect of things you might not oversee. My first book, The Conductors, for example, utilizes the main character is a dressmaker, a blacksmith, and those were kind of roles that kind of paired well with the elements of fantasy I want to look into, the crafting side, but also because they're behind the scenes aspect of things. I think I remember coming across that there's a dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln she was a black dressmaker. She made a lot of these dress during the Civil War period. And she wrote a book that I guess got her some trouble years later, but these fascinating stories we don't really hear about. We don't know about people behind the scenes making these big splashy details. And there's also we also kind of overlook certain aspects of things that it's fun for me to explore and bring into the stories. But one of my more recent books, The Improvisers, kind of focuses on the black pilots at the time period, specifically the Chicago area. But because it became domestic home, we also overlooked the other pilots that came afterwards that led to the other succeeding airmen. But I took me in the 1930s, looking at the in-between period, the kind of the bridge area, which is to me, there's a lot of things we kind of innovation of doing, kind of making their own way. And I think that's what really inspires me looking into the quieter periods of history, is people who are making their own ways, doing things that will kind of plant the seeds for later on, and we can point to certain things, whether it's social movements and whatnot. I came across a lot of things that we associate with the civil rights movement in the 1960s, 1950s, that had started way back as early as 1870s, 1840s even. That we recognize that of these certain elements that come bear fruit later on, and that's why I continue to find these little stories in mind, to make my little creations to kind of share with the world, to inspire and hopefully get people to dive into this history to find the greater details that I'm only shining a little bit of light onto.
I'm actually a bit fascinated by what you said, especially when talking about domino effects of history, and that seems like also a tricky thing to writing domino effects that make sense, but also domino effects that don't look perfect, because history is a bit random. Sometimes, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was because their car broke down and they happened to break down right in front of the restaurant where Gavrilo Princip, the assassin, was eating and had just given up and just said, oh, he's right there, I'm gonna take my chance. Random moments in history. But whenever you try and write random events in alternate history, people think that's unrealistic, despite the fact that's how it has happened so many times. It can have sensible and logical and illogical. But in change for how it affects the social classes, how, like when you were talking about the Kitty Hawk, I was also thinking, yeah, how does that affect the status of women going forward if it is known that a woman contributed to America's success in the advent of flight technology? How does that change? I was also thinking, like, especially with alternate West African history, how does that affect the lives of slaves? And I'm not talking about the West Atlantic slave trade, I'm talking about the slavery that existed before, right? And food for thought, what if all of a sudden, all the slaves suddenly got magic, but the slave owners didn't? What happens then? So, yeah, but how, and you also have to think with the alternate history as well, or even future, what possible new social or political classes could be created, right? Like say, if your families were the ones that were magic, do you have these magical dynasties, these magical hierarchies that are set about? How do they insert themselves well into the existing political structure, or do they override the political overstructure? Ironically, the new Superman movie that came out just had that as an implication at the very end when saying, okay, these beings can now act outside international government control. How do we move forward when Superman exists? How do we do world politics when Superman is just going to fly and save and not do the politically inconvenient thing, but focuses on doing the right thing? How does the geopolitics change? How does world change? How does attitude change? That sort of thing. While superheroes are not often touched, I think it's an interesting idea to go for. How do superheroes affect geopolitics?
I was going to say, I think that's a thought I was often had in comic books that superheroes can help. Yeah, I resonate with that.
Yeah, history is amazingly contingent. A lot of things happened that people at the time did not believe was going to happen. And a lot of alternate, when academics are studying history, they often look at what the people at the time thought was going to happen next and compare it to what really happened next. That's kind of a technique in historiography and that kind of thing. So I think that one of the reasons why alternate history is so compelling, I think, is that we do it all the time in our own lives. We think, oh, what if I hadn't done that? What if I hadn't said that? What if I'd made a different decision in my life? There are certainly many times in my life when I made decisions kind of on the spur of the moment, which had a huge effect on what happened later. Some of them may not have brought me to the States at all. So yes, and I think that's part of the compulsion of alternate history, is exploring those paths not taken.
And I think there's a great political thing about showing history as contingent, even if it's done through fantastical means. Even if it's something, that we're not, the hard SF brain goes, well, that's not the way it could have happened or ever would, Because showing it as contingent, well, the example I like is L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, of the radical wing of the American women's suffragette movement, was also one of the originators of the idea of a matriarchal prehistory. Now, it's prehistory, so it's very hard for anyone to say anything definitive about it from anthropological finds and whatever survives in mythology. But the important thing isn't whether what she came up with is going to meet some historical design. The important thing is it gets people to think, well, it doesn't have to be this way. And whether that's through magic or a different outcome in known history or something that happened before history was being taken down, that gives a movement a power, to be able to say, just that first start, that it doesn't have to be this way.
That's great. I think we have time for a few questions. Yes?
Speaking of time travel and alternate history, obligatory disclosure, I have four short stories written in the 1632 universe, which is one of the most popular alternate histories there are. There's over 23, 24 novels, and I have no idea how many short fiction. A small town of about 3,500 West Virginians winds up suddenly in southwestern Germany in the middle of the 30 Years' War. There is no magic at all. It is all about what would work, what people who went back change, and what they want to change. One of which happens to be ending the slave trade before it starts.
Not sure that was a question, but
Hi. I just wanted to know, Nicole, where are you going to get your research for these people who are often talked about in history?
Yes. There's different ways. I always start my research in the library. I look for not just the secondary stuff, but also primary resources. When I was writing conductors, I got really lucky. I found a pocket journal. Blanking on the name right now. It was a pocket journal of a free woman that lived in Philadelphia during the Civil War. So you got her day-to-day stuff about her, not just going to work and school and all her. She was also a dressmaker too, doing all this stuff, but also her complaining about the weather, complaining about going to social engagements and things like that. And there was a fun section. Well, I shouldn't say fun, but there's a section in the back of the pocket diary where she shares some thoughts about seeing Lincoln's body in tombs when they visited Philadelphia and stuff like that. So it's a really nuanced way to see. You don't really, it's really special because you don't really see this particular person at that time period. You always get the resources from people who are rich and things like that. So this is just an average, ordinary person that's doing day-to-day life. So finding primary sources of that are great. I did a lot of looking into newspapers at the time period, getting the highlights, especially as I moved into my books in the 1930s, 1960s. That look at the highlight newspapers, magazines. That it gives you the what's going on, what they're talking about, not just the big stories, but also the smaller things in between. Because I think there's also like personal classified. We look for love matches in these newspapers as well, as well as the other big newspaper articles. And just being careful about where you're getting the secondary resources from. Because there's lots of books about these different time periods. We got to look about who's writing about these things. Everyone has the agenda for things. So just kind of resource and just keep looking, and also do a lot of these. Well, I guess I should mention museum. I did 3 visits to National African Heritage Museum in DC. 3 visits, found lots of things. I think and ironically, that's why I learned about like Oak Bluffs and Martha Vineyard, because I never realized there was a black presence in Martha Vineyard. I thought, oh, this is black people. And fun fact, Martha Vineyard is not named after any famous Martha you're thinking about. But anyway, just going to different resources, like museums, talking to people. There's, of course, talking to librarians, talking about the story. There's lots of history in your area, too. Because I found out where I live in Norfolk Virginia Beach area, there is the secret order of tents. I don't know if you've seen like something on social media years ago, but like talking about it's like an order of black women with it. It's basically like a mutual aid thing, but it's like the order of tents basically started in Norfolk, but literally down the road from me, which I did not realize until social media showed me there. But there's lots of history around you. Reach out to people, go out to museums, go to historical sites, dive deep into the archives. Don't be afraid to use your library resources, those interlibrary loans, and also explore, if you can, to visit places. You can get the lay of the land. Since I'm writing history, I end up using a lot of the maps of the time period. So for example, when I was writing my books in Philadelphia 1870s, W. D. Bois did this famous studies of the Philadelphia. It was mostly the 1890s, 1900s, but I was able to use a lot of the streets to give me an idea of how my characters would walk through the area at that time period. So look for different resources and keep your eyes open for there's always more research to find as you write these books, even after you finish.
Should I just talk? I can do that. I can project. Something I've been thinking about hearing you talk about writing in alternate and secret history in the contemporary moment is I'm wondering if any changes to your practice or how you think about it have come up as we've seen a rise in the proliferation of actual conspiracy theories and the increasing number of people who publicly espouse highest levels of our government now trying to enforce the teaching of effectively alternate history to students, and whether you try to stay away from it so that those people don't get to have any control over your work, or whether you engage with that in order to see whether you may be inadvertently reinforcing some kind of biased version that is actually proliferating in terms of, secret groups of people controlling everything or things of that nature. So I'm wondering whether anything about your practice has changed as we've seen that really unfortunate development. Not that those beliefs weren't always there, but that there's much more public penetration because of mass communications.
Okay, so the question was, how has the rising conspiracy theories and people's alternate histories invented for political purposes, how has that changed our practice as writers?
If at all.
If at all.
Well, within my secret histories, the villains were these people. So in a sense, yeah, it's made conspiracy theories a lot less fun. We are not back in the 90s with the X-Files when it's all fun and games and laughs. It's become a deadly serious problem. And it's a serious problem in that writing alternate histories, it only has resonance if you know what actually happened. If you don't understand what actually happened, then we're just not doing anything very much of we should be writing something else, because all the resonance is the disjunction between what did happen and what we're writing about. So we have a vested interest in having the facts out there and not having these alternate narratives and not having these values that skew facts so widely that come up with just horrible versions of what people thought about various horrible things back in their contemporary times, which are usually wrong. Usually, even at the time, people knew what was right and what was wrong and what they were doing.
Sounds like in the future we'll have to write extremely strong disclaimers at the front of the books. But yes, towards what you were thinking, there is one big example that I can think of. The works of L. Ron Hubbard and what we have today because of his writing. We get Scientology and the big alternate history movement because people were really invested into the conspiracy side of the books that they made a movement out of it.
I don't think it's changed my writing too much so far. I think it might well do in the future as things continue to develop. I think by and large I'm writing long enough ago. I think the social movements that we're seeing now do have an effect on the things that I was writing then, particularly with regard to Native American cultures and things like that. That had played a very big part in the Clash of Eagles series, but I don't think that's quite what we're talking about.
I kind of just laugh when I see these conspiracy theories, like, we totally landed on the moon, all this other stuff. I don't know, I guess it doesn't make me stronger to get my story out there and just share and, debunk and talk about things as much as possible to drown out the noise, basically.
Education is always good. The Clash of Eagles books, just very briefly, largely set in the city of Cahokia, Native American city where St. Louis is now, a mound city of 20,000 people, which actually existed. But all of the time, like in 2015 when I was first promoting these books, I would say like 1 in 3 people who came up to me at science fiction conventions thought I invented Cahokia. And this obviously, there's something failing in the educational system if kids being brought up in the States don't really know the true history of the Native American cultures that lived on these lands before the Westerners did.
I think we have to wrap up, unfortunately. I just wanted to say that maybe we could go down and you could each say how we could contact you if you have a quick idea of an alternate history or some kind of historical science fiction fantasy work by someone that you'd like to recommend to our audience. And I also forgot to say that I have a book out that is about a historical figure, Nikola Tesla. And some of us have books that will be available inside in the Charm Books table, and we'll also be autographing So,
Again, Tom Doyle, yes, my books are on the table. I'm going to throw out Nisi Shaw's Everfair, An Alternate History of the Congo, which, again, one of these books that shows how different it could have been.
I'm Alan Smale. You can find me at alansmale.com and under that name, ALANSMALE, on Facebook and various other social media things. With regards to books, I've already promoted Annalee Hewitt's book. I keep calling her Hewitt. There are other books that I'm very fond of. We didn't actually mention P. Jelly Clark after all this time. His Master of Gin is extremely good. I like Carrie Vaughan's The Naturalist Society in terms of kind of fantastic histories. And there's a book that not many people know about called Between the Helpless and the Darkness by Brent Olson, in which Harold Hardrada survives his battle in 1066. And that is much more of a character study. It's much more of like, how would his thoughts have changed? How would that human being have changed as a result of the change in historical conditions?
Once again, I'm Nicole Glover. You can find me on social media, usually as Nicole Glover Writes. I guess Instagram and Blue Sky and stuff like that. My books are available. My next one is coming out in January. It's a more historical fantasy, 1960s, Magical NASA. You can also, I'll be hanging around here. I have a signing right after this event's over, so if you want to talk some more, do that. And I think we mentioned a lot of the authors I wanted to, you mentioned one of those, Kathleen started Mary Robin McLeod, one of my favorite ones to mention.
I highly recommend Lion's Blood by Stephen Barnes, which was written in 2002. Specifically, it explores what if the Islamic caliphates of Africa remained the technological and literature centers of the world, because at one point in time, during the golden age of Islam, a lot of these North African, Middle Eastern caliphates, where all the technology was, where all the science and literature and learning was. What if the book goes over how does that world go on if Europe remains at the time a relative, what's the word I'm looking for, backwater? Yes, backwater. So I highly recommend Lion's Blood by Stephen Barnes.